Skallagrim wakes in the middle of a fight for his life, with only the vaguest idea of who he is. Facing an angry mob of murderous cutthroats, he watches helplessly while the love of his life is abducted before his eyes. Finally, with a crushing sense of despair, he realizes he's going to die without even knowing her name. Hello and welcome to Liam's Lyceum. I'm your host Liam, aka Hamvar, and today I'll be doing a spoiler-free review of Stephen R. Babb's Skallagrim and the Vales of Pagarna. Skallagrim and the Vales of Pagarna is a 2022 novel by Stephen R. Babb. I'm not 100% sure how to say that actually. Who is famously known actually as a member of the band Glass Hammer. I believe he generally goes just by Steve. Babb here, sorry if I'm saying that wrong, gives us a good tale that actually mixes, I would say, epic fantasy and sword and sorcery quite well. And I'll get more into that. The story starts, kind of the blurb says, it is in the decadent and sorcerous city of Archon. Skallagrim gets the crud beat out of him, and he's not a warrior. He's never actually killed anyone at the start of the story, but he seems to own a sword that changes its situation, and it kind of evens out the terrible odds. It's actually quite epic. It's quite a masterful opening. We know little of Skallagrim besides that he is a thief and has brought a woman to Archon, one that he loves, and one whose name he cannot remember. He has amnesia, remembering his name and profession, but essentially nothing else. Shortly after the start, he finds that he is essentially a wanted man for the disaster of the first few chapters. Whether this is completely deserved is rather murky. And one thing I learned after I started reading this is that the story actually follows that of the album Dreaming City by Glass Hammer. So you can listen to that album and get the story, essentially, of Skallagrim here. This is the first in a series, though it is not a standalone. So our protagonist is, of course, Skallagrim, which I imagine is taken from Norse myth. Egil Skallagrimson, of course, his dad is Skallagrim, who is, I believe, half troll or something like that. He's got troll blood in him, I'm pretty sure. We're in his head most of the time, but it's technically a third-person omniscient narrator, which is kind of interesting. I think some people don't really like that, but we do have other characters like Erling and Hartbert. They're support characters. We get some time from them, but we also have the villain, essentially, Fornius Druogorim, and we get some time with him as well. He's kind of a classic baddie. Now, I think the style here is actually, to me, was the most noteworthy thing, and that it's because it affects the story so much as well. So it has great dialogue. It's sometimes a little prolix, such as Erling, who tended to have exposition-heavy amounts of dialogue at the beginning of the story. But we have great sorcery and otherworldliness. Just this prose is really good. I'm going to share some examples actually here, and they're from the beginning of the story, so you don't need to worry. But we have also this magical sword called Terminus. It's kind of reminiscent of Stormbringer, though the name itself kind of calls back to Terminus Est from Book of the New Sun. It's creepy at times. The story is gray most of the time. It's very black and bleak at other times. It's a weary world and a touch darker, I'd say, than Tolkien's. Though I think epic fantasy fans will still enjoy it, as the mystery established at the beginning gets some answers. The poetry and sometimes flowery prose at length, longer than most sword and sorcery, should also appeal to those readers, but might not appeal to like your typical sword and sorcery reader, because it's also definitely not a standalone in some ways. My main critique would actually be the length, and it's not long at all. That's probably mostly my mood I was in when I was reading it. But speaking of mood, I like the mood, I like the tone a lot of the story. It was kind of, it felt like two tones sometimes. In some ways it reminded me of like Clark Ashton Smith or Wolf or Fulmar even, but other times it felt very lighthearted, almost like a Fafhrd and Grey Mouser thing, especially when Erling and Hartbert were involved. Right, and here are these two samples I just want to share real quick. These are quotes from the book. These musings were not the product of his mind. It was the sword, the poetry of its sinuous shape and design that inspired these grandiose ideas of war and of alliances seldom considered, partnerships between men and the iron they wielded rather than the treacherous coalitions of tribes and nations. And the second one, the Vales of Pagarna were, as far as anyone in Archon knew, virtually uninhabited. Ancient, crumbling towers were strewn among the forested ridges and craggy mountains on either side of the river, squatting empty and lightless, watching over the sad ruins of villages and towns that had been abandoned for hundreds of years. And I think it's just prose like this, honestly, that maybe not really a critique, but as far as I'm aware, there is no audiobook for this. I should have asked Steve beforehand if there's one in the works or if there's one planned or hoped for. I think this book would do really well as an audiobook, to be completely honest, with the right narrator, of course. So, anyways, those are my thoughts. Maybe go check this out. Pretty cool, pretty promising series as well. So, anyways, this has been Liam Lyceum. I'll catch you next time.